November 20th, 2004, began as a night of celebration for Corey Shane Braun. The 24-year-old oilfield operator had traveled south from Fort St. John, British Columbia, crossing the provincial border into Peace River, Alberta, to attend his company's annual Christmas party at the Peace Valley Inns. The hotel sat on the edge of town, its south side backing onto sloped terrain that descended sharply toward the river valley below. By late evening, the temperature had already begun to drop, and a layer of frost coated the ground outside the warmth of the banquet hall. The party wound down after midnight. Corey, along with several co-workers, left the hotel and walked the short distance to the nearby 12-foot Davis gas station. The group was in good spirits, loosened by alcohol and the rare opportunity to unwind after weeks of long shifts in the northern oil fields. But outside the brightly lit convenience store, a brief verbal altercation erupted with two men lingering near the entrance. Words were exchanged. Tension flared. Then, as quickly as it began, the confrontation ended. The group separated and went their separate ways. At approximately 3 a.m., Corey and his co-workers returned to the south entrance of the Peace Valley Inns. The parking lot was dim, lit only by scattered overhead fixtures that cast long shadows across the pavement and snow-dusted grass. The group stood together for a moment near the entrance, exchanging goodnights before heading to their rooms. Corey separated from the others and began walking in the direction of his assigned room. He was visible for only a few seconds before he disappeared from view beyond the edge of the building. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Corey Shane Braun alive. No one heard a shout. No one saw him stumble or fall. No alarm was raised in those early morning hours. The hotel remained quiet. The parking lot, empty. The steep slope behind the property, concealed in darkness and edged with frozen brush, gave no indication of what had just occurred mere feet from where his co-workers stood. By sunrise, the temperature had plummeted further. A light snow had begun to fall, covering the ground in a fresh layer of white. And Corey, expected to check out and return home with his crew later that morning, was gone. When Corey Shane Braun separated from his co-workers at the south entrance of the Peace Valley Inns shortly after 3 a.m., he walked only a few steps in the direction of his assigned room before stopping. The parking lot was quiet. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. Most of the hotel guests had already turned in for the night. The celebration was over, but Corey did not go inside. According to reconstructed accounts developed through later interviews and information, something kept him from heading straight to bed. He was still unsettled from the verbal altercation at the 12-foot Davis gas station earlier that night. The exchange had been brief, sharp words between strangers fueled by alcohol and misplaced pride. But it had not fully resolved. It lingered in his mind. He stepped back outside for a moment, seeking cold air and a chance to clear his head before calling it a night. The south side of the hotel was poorly lit. A handful of overhead fixtures cast uneven pools of light across the asphalt and patches of frozen grass. Beyond the edge of the parking area, the ground sloped sharply downward toward the river valley that flanked the property. The incline was steep and irregular, covered in frost, scattered brush, and fallen branches. In the daylight, the drop-off was visible. In the dark, it was nearly impossible to see. Corey stood near the edge of the lot, his breath visible in the frigid air. That was when he noticed movement near a parked truck. One of the men from the gas station altercation was standing there. The man had followed the group back from the convenience store. He was still intoxicated, still irritated, and unwilling to let the earlier confrontation go. He had not come looking for serious violence, but he had not come to apologize either. His presence in the parking lot was the product of impaired judgment, lingering anger, and the kind of reckless decision-making that alcohol magnifies in the early hours of the morning. The man called out to Corey. Corey, tired and also affected by the night of drinking, responded. His tone was defensive. The exchange escalated immediately. Both men misjudged the situation. Both believed the other was pushing too far. What began as words quickly turned into something physical. The man stepped closer. Corey stepped back. Neither was thinking clearly. Neither was prepared for what happened next. The struggle was brief and chaotic. Corey continued to move backward, trying to create distance. The man followed, shoving him during the confrontation. The frozen ground beneath them was slick with frost. The edge of the slope, concealed in darkness, was only feet away. Corey lost his footing. He stumbled backward, arms flailing for balance, and fell. The incline dropped sharply away from the parking lot, and Corey tumbled down the uneven terrain. Halfway down the slope, his head struck something solid. A rock, a piece of concrete, or a frozen edge of debris hidden beneath the frost. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Corey lost consciousness instantly. He did not cry out. He did not get back up. He lay motionless in the brush and frozen dirt, invisible from the parking lot above. The other man, suddenly sober with panic, scrambled down the slope after him. He found Corey unresponsive, his body crumpled among the branches and undergrowth. The realization of what had just happened hit with full force. This was no longer a drunken argument. This was serious. This was bad. And the man was already in trouble with the law. He was on probation for unrelated issues in his own life. He knew what an arrest would mean. He knew what being connected to this scene would cost him. Fear overrode every other instinct. He did not call for help. He did not run back to the hotel. Instead, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He grabbed Corey by the arms and dragged him farther down the slope, deeper into the brush and fallen branches that lined the base of the incline. He intended to hide the encounter, to conceal what had happened long enough to figure out what to do next. He told himself he would come back. He told himself he would fix it. But he never did. The man climbed back up to the parking lot, checked to make sure no one had seen him, and left the area. He returned to wherever he had been staying that night, his mind racing with excuses and rationalizations. He convinced himself that Corey might wake up on his own. He convinced himself that someone else would find him. He convinced himself that staying quiet was the only way to survive. But Corey Shane Braun was not going to wake up. The blow to his head had been severe. Even if he had regained consciousness, he was now lying exposed in sub-freezing temperatures with no coat, no help, and no way to call for assistance. The temperature continued to drop throughout the night. Hypothermia set in quickly. By the time the sun began to rise over Peace River a few hours later, Corey had succumbed to the cold. His body came to rest in a concealed pocket of terrain that was almost invisible from above. The slope was steep and uneven, covered in dense brush, scattered debris, and the kind of natural camouflage that makes an object or a person nearly impossible to locate without knowing exactly where to look. Overnight, a light snow had begun to fall, covering the area in a fresh layer of white. The frost thickened, the ground hardened, and Corey disappeared from view. By morning, when his co-workers realized he had not returned to his room, the scene had already been transformed. There were no visible signs of struggle in the parking lot. No blood, no torn clothing, no footprints leading toward the slope. The snowfall had erased whatever physical evidence might have existed on the surface. The brush and undergrowth concealed the rest. The reconstructed timeline, developed years later through painstaking interviews and pieced together information, reveals the tragic sequence of events with brutal clarity. Corey did not leave the hotel willingly. He was not abducted by strangers. He did not wander off into the night on his own. He died only a short distance from where he was last seen, unseen in the darkness below the slope behind the Peace Valley Inns. The man responsible never came forward. He moved away from the area quietly in the months that followed, carrying the weight of what happened with him. It was not premeditated. It was not an act of calculated violence. It was a drunken confrontation that spiraled out of control, followed by a moment of panic and a decision to stay silent. But the consequences were permanent. Corey Shane Braun, 24 years old, an oil field operator with a future ahead of him, was gone. And for years, no one knew why. The first indication that something was wrong came later that morning, when Corey Shane Braun failed to meet his coworkers for checkout. The group had planned to leave Peace River together and return to Fort St. John after the company Christmas party. When Corey did not answer his door and did not respond to phone calls, his colleagues assumed he had overslept or was dealing with a hangover. They knocked again. They waited. Eventually, concern began to replace annoyance. Hotel staff were contacted. A manager accompanied the group to Corey's assigned room and unlocked the door. The room was empty. The bed had not been slept in. Corey's belongings were still inside, untouched. His vehicle remained in the parking lot. There was no note, no indication of where he had gone, and no explanation for his absence. By early afternoon, Corey's co-workers contacted his family in Fort St. John. The conversation was tense and uncertain. No one wanted to escalate the situation prematurely, but no one could explain where Corey had gone. His family tried calling his cell phone repeatedly. The calls went unanswered. Messages went unreturned. The growing silence felt wrong. That evening, the family contacted the Peace Regional RCMP to report Corey missing. Officers responded quickly, recognizing the unusual circumstances. A 24-year-old man does not simply vanish from a hotel in the middle of the night without his belongings, his vehicle, or any form of communication. The initial assessment suggested foul play, accident, or disorientation, but nothing pointed clearly in any single direction. Law enforcement arrived at the Peace Valley Inns to begin their investigation. Officers interviewed Corey's co-workers, reconstructing the timeline of the previous night. They learned about the company Christmas party, the trip to the 12-foot Davis gas station, and the brief verbal altercation that had occurred outside the convenience store. They learned that Corey had been drinking but was not incapacitated. They learned that he had separated from the group at approximately 3 a.m. near the south entrance of the hotel, walking in the direction of his room. That was the last confirmed sighting. RCMP officers began a systematic search of the hotel property and surrounding area. They walked the perimeter of the building, examined the parking lot, and checked the visible grounds along the main riverbank. The terrain behind the hotel was steep and heavily vegetated, but from the parking lot, there was no obvious indication that anyone had gone down the slope. The fresh snow from the previous night had covered much of the ground, obscuring footprints and any other surface evidence that might have existed. Search teams expanded their efforts throughout the following days. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in combing the area around the Peace Valley Inns. They walked the riverbank, searched nearby wooded areas, and checked local businesses and residences. Flyers with Corey's photograph and physical description were distributed throughout Peace River and Fort St. John. The case received attention from local media, and tips began to come in from the public. But none of the tips led anywhere. None of the searches turned up evidence. Corey Shane Braun had vanished. Forensic teams returned to the hotel to conduct a more detailed examination of the scene. They photographed the parking lot, documented the layout of the property, and interviewed additional witnesses who had been present the night of the party. Officers returned to the 12-foot Davis gas station to review surveillance footage and speak with employees who had been working during the early morning hours of November 20th. The altercation outside the store was confirmed, but the individuals involved could not be immediately identified. The exchange had been brief, and no one had reported it at the time. Investigators also examined Corey's personal belongings, looking for clues about his state of mind or plans. There was no indication that he had been planning to leave the area. His wallet, identification, and personal items were still in his hotel room. His vehicle keys were present. His cell phone, however, was missing, though it had either been turned off or lost signal shortly after his disappearance, rendering it untraceable. The search effort intensified. RCMP brought in additional personnel and resources. K-9 units were deployed to track any scent trails leading away from the hotel. The dogs indicated interest in certain areas near the south side of the property, but the steep, uneven terrain and heavy snowfall complicated their efforts. The river valley below the hotel was difficult to access, and visibility was limited. Search teams did their best to cover the area, but the landscape was vast, the weather was harsh, and the window for finding someone alive in freezing temperatures was closing rapidly. Days turned into weeks. The initial urgency of the search gave way to a grim realization. If Corey had been injured or disoriented the night he disappeared, he would not have survived the sub-freezing temperatures for long. The focus of the investigation began to shift from rescue to recovery. Public reaction to Corey's disappearance was widespread. The case resonated with families across northern British Columbia and Alberta, where the oil industry employs thousands of young workers who travel frequently for their jobs. Corey was one of their own, a hard-working 24-year-old who had simply attended a company party and never made it home. The circumstances were unsettling. There was no clear explanation, no closure, no answers. His family issued public appeals for information. They spoke to local news outlets, pleading for anyone who had seen Corey or knew anything about his whereabouts to come forward. They returned to Peace River repeatedly, walking the same streets and searching the same areas that law enforcement had already covered. They refused to accept that Corey was simply gone. But the physical evidence remained elusive. The slope behind the Peace Valley Inns, where Corey's body had come to rest in a concealed pocket of brush and debris, was not adequately searched during the initial investigation. The terrain was too steep, too overgrown, and too dangerous for search teams to thoroughly cover in winter conditions. Seasonal changes compounded the problem. Winter runoff, shifting vegetation, and natural debris movement gradually buried the site deeper beneath layers of organic material and soil. Corey Shane Braun was not hidden far from where he was last seen. He was hidden well. For his family, the lack of answers was unbearable. For law enforcement, the case became a frustrating deadlock. There were no witnesses to what happened after Corey separated from his co-workers. There were no surveillance cameras covering the south side of the hotel. There were no physical clues pointing toward abduction, suicide, or voluntary departure. The investigation stalled, and as the months passed, the case went cold. As the initial search and rescue efforts failed to yield results, investigators and Corey's family confronted a growing list of frustrating obstacles and dead ends. The sheer absence of conclusive evidence and witness testimony hampered progress from the earliest stages, setting the tone for an investigation that would suffer repeated disappointments and strategic oversights. Within days of Corey's disappearance, search teams conducted extensive sweeps of the Peace Valley Inn's property, its parking lots, nearby wooded areas, and the main riverbank. These early efforts, though diligent, repeatedly failed to uncover any sign of Corey, his clothing, or possible traces of an altercation. What quickly became apparent was how nature and circumstance had conspired to hide physical evidence. Snowfall the night Corey vanished had erased potential footprints and disturbed ground, while thick undergrowth and winter debris covered possible clues. Canine units struggled on the steep slope, no scent leading definitively to Corey's fate. Inside the hotel, nothing gave investigators pause. Corey's room was neatly arranged, personal belongings and identification left behind. The forensic team was unable to detect blood, fibers, or any physical residue that could suggest a violent encounter. Without signs of forced entry or struggle, investigators considered a range of theories: voluntary disappearance, accidental misadventure, or foul play. However, all lines of inquiry ran into the same wall: lack of material evidence. Interviewing hotel guests, staff, and Corey's co-workers yielded little. The last collective memory placed Corey near his room after returning from the gas station, with no one observing him depart or interact further with anyone. This absence of direct witnesses proved critical. Several party guests remembered the brief altercation at the 12-foot Davis gas station, describing the confrontation as tense but brief, with little apparent consequence. However, none saw the individuals from the gas station return to the hotel or interact with Corey outside or near the parking lot. Investigators faced contradictory accounts regarding Corey's state of mind and activity. Some colleagues described him as mildly agitated after the gas station argument, but others reported he seemed relaxed and entirely focused on winding down after the party. No single narrative dominated, complicating efforts to narrow down credible lines of inquiry. The gas station altercation itself remained poorly documented. Surveillance footage confirmed Corey's presence, but neither captured audio nor the subsequent movements of involved parties. Police cataloged descriptions and attempted to locate the two men from the argument, but encountered difficulties. No one in the immediate aftermath could decisively identify the men, nor did witnesses recall their vehicle make or license plate. The possibility of abduction or premeditated harm circulated early in the investigation, stoked by the lack of Corey's body or any traceable exit from the hotel property. Police canvassed local offenders and persons of interest, focusing first on known troublemakers and individuals with criminal records in Peace River and Fort St. John. None emerged as credible suspects. RCMP ran background checks, cross-referenced missing persons and transient populations, and pursued rumors in local bars and workplaces. Each lead fizzled, lacking any connection to Corey. Efforts to pin down the identity of the men from the gas station confrontation also faded. Despite a public call for information broadcast by local media and police interviews with gas station employees, no constituent thread linked the altercation definitively to Corey's disappearance. Several individuals voluntarily came forward, but their involvement proved tangential at best. Outside the direct investigation, the persistent silence from Corey's cell phone added another layer of frustration. Technical attempts to triangulate its last known location were stymied by outdated records and inconsistent tower coverage in Peace River. Digital forensics failed to find evidence of outgoing calls, texts, or social media activity after the early morning hours. His phone simply vanished with him. The steep, wooded slope behind Peace Valley Inns represented one of the most significant missed opportunities. Search efforts and forensic sweeps prioritized visible ground. Parking lots, motor access roads, major trails, and riverbank areas accessible to public rescue teams and canine units. The rugged, brush-choked drop behind the hotel required specialized teams, technical rope access, and careful navigation. In the harsh Canadian winter, with fresh snow compounding the hazard, these deep terrain searches were limited in scope. By the time the spring thaw arrived, natural processes had thoroughly concealed the scene. Runoff, shifting debris, and new growth buried any trace of human passage, rendering the site virtually undetectable even to trained eyes. The investigation reached its first intractable dead end. With no answers, no evidence, and no progress, the case entered cold status. With the disappearance unresolved, Corey's family engaged the media, enlisting public help in spreading the word and generating tips. Community members distributed flyers throughout Alberta and British Columbia. Neither social pressure nor mounting media coverage garnered useful new leads. The case lingered in the public's memory, but began to fade over time as families, businesses, and law enforcement shifted focus to other cases and priorities. Rumors and speculative theories abounded in online forums and local conversation. Some suggested Corey had fallen victim to a random act of violence. Others posited he had wandered off while intoxicated, only to suffer an accident. Misinformation muddied efforts to aggregate credible evidence, with internet sleuths revisiting known facts, and local rumors on forums for years without concrete progress. Through every phase of dead-end searching, Corey's family endured repeated cycles of hope and heartbreak. Each change in season brought the possibility of new clues revealed as snow melted and brush thinned. Local search teams, sometimes joined by experts in missing persons cases, periodically revisited the terrain in and around Peace Valley inns. But each time, nothing new surfaced. The RCMP's willingness to revisit the case depended heavily on the emergence of new evidence or credible tips. After the first year without resolution, the investigation lost steam. Case files were reviewed, classified, and archived. Leads that led nowhere were closed and forgotten. For the family, the frustration of, he was just a few steps away, yet nobody saw a thing, was an injury compounded by bureaucratic inertia and the limits of search technology at the time. Experts in cold case investigations have since reviewed the Corey Shane Braun investigation, noting several key structural failures. The immediate focus on typical routes and visible terrain, to the exclusion of the more inaccessible, steep-sided valley behind the hotel. Failure to engage technical search specialists for deep slope investigation during the early period when clues were most likely to be present. Lack of rigorous documentation, collection of possible physical evidence in high-traffic areas frequented by Corey and his co-workers. Inability to positively identify or track down the men from the gas station altercation due to weak witness recall and missing surveillance details. Digital forensic limitations, with cell phone and device tracking hampered by infrastructure gaps and technological capabilities in 2004. Fluctuating and sometimes conflicting witness statements, giving rise to multiple theories but no actionable leads. Weather and environmental changes that rapidly degraded scene integrity and erased traces. Corey's disappearance became a symbol of investigative frustration, a high-profile case with seemingly clear initial context that quickly descended into ambiguity and deadlock. Despite persistent community advocacy, periodic renewed searches, and out-of-area speculation, no definitive evidence surfaced for years. The investigation into Corey Shane Braun's disappearance, after its initial flurry of activity, became defined by its failures and dead ends. Critical physical evidence was lost to weather and terrain. Credible witnesses could not be found, and those who did speak provided unclear or contradictory accounts. The incident at the gas station, a key moment in the reconstructed timeline, never provided an identifiable suspect despite police efforts. The family and community endured long stretches of silence intermixed with bursts of unfounded hope, as fresh tips and rumors arose but never resolved the central question. The slope behind Peace Valley Inns, which would eventually be revealed as the site of Corey's fall and death, remained unsearched and unremarked in the crucial early days and months of the case. With no body, no clear cause, and no suspect, the investigation was forced to accept the limits of its capacity and resources. Corey, in the world's official records, simply vanished during a brief gap in his co-worker's sight, leaving behind an enduring mystery marked by profound evidentiary gaps and missed opportunities. The investigation's failures set the stage for later developments, when new information and re-examined witness accounts would ultimately illuminate the real sequence of events. A story buried in plain sight in the winter slopes behind the hotel. For years, the disappearance of Corey Shane Braun remained an unsolved mystery that haunted his family, frustrated investigators, and lingered in the collective memory of Peace River and Fort St. John communities. The case had gone cold, filed away among hundreds of other unresolved missing persons investigations across northern Canada. But cold cases do not remain static. They evolve as time passes. Witnesses reconsider their silence, and investigative techniques advance. The breakthrough in understanding what happened to Corey did not come suddenly. It came gradually, through a painstaking process of re-examination, new interviews, and the slow accumulation of information that had remained buried for years. The first stirrings of progress emerged when the case was revisited by investigators as part of a broader review of unsolved missing persons cases in Alberta. Advances in forensic technology, combined with evolving investigative practices, prompted law enforcement agencies to take a fresh look at files that had languished without resolution. Corey's case was among those selected for renewed attention. The re-examination began with a methodical review of the original case files. Investigators reread witness statements, studied crime scene photographs, and retraced the timeline of Corey's final hours. They also reached out to individuals who had been interviewed in 2004, seeking clarification on details that had seemed insignificant at the time but might hold new meaning in light of broader context. One crucial element of this renewed effort was the recognition that the initial investigation had focused heavily on visible, accessible terrain. The steep slope behind the Peace Valley Inns, difficult to navigate and obscured by vegetation, had received only cursory attention during the early searches. Investigators began to consider whether critical evidence might have been missed simply because the terrain was too challenging to thoroughly cover in winter conditions. As investigators re-engaged with the case, they conducted new interviews with individuals connected to the events of November 20th, 2004. Some of these interviews targeted Corey's co-workers and friends, seeking to fill in gaps or clarify inconsistencies in the original timeline. Others focused on individuals who had been present at the Peace Valley Inns or the 12-foot Davis gas station that night, but had not been thoroughly questioned at the time. Time has a way of loosening tongues. People who were reluctant to speak in 2004, whether out of fear, loyalty, or uncertainty, sometimes become willing to share information years later. Witnesses who had been too intoxicated to recall details clearly during the initial investigation found that fragments of memory had clarified over time. Others, no longer connected to the community or fearing repercussions, felt safer coming forward with information they had withheld. Through these interviews, a more complete picture of the altercation at the gas station began to emerge. Investigators learned more about the two men involved in the confrontation with Corey and his co-workers. Descriptions became more detailed. Behavioral patterns were identified, And slowly, the possibility that one of those men had followed the group back to the hotel gained credibility. One interview in particular proved pivotal. A former acquaintance of one of the men from the gas station came forward with information about that individual's behavior in the weeks and months following Corey's disappearance. The acquaintance described the man as being noticeably unsettled, withdrawn, and evasive when asked about his activities on the night of November 20th. The man had left Peace River quietly several months after Corey vanished, cutting ties with the local community and relocating without explanation. This testimony did not constitute proof, but it provided investigators with a credible lead, someone whose movements, mindset, and timeline aligned with the possibility of involvement in Corey's disappearance. Armed with new information, investigators worked to reconstruct a more detailed and believable timeline of what happened after Corey separated from his coworkers at the hotel entrance. The revised timeline incorporated witness accounts, environmental factors, and forensic analysis of the terrain behind the Peace Valley Inns. The reconstruction revealed several critical insights. Corey had indeed stepped back outside after initially heading toward his room. Multiple witnesses confirmed his state of mind, unsettled by the gas station altercation and seeking fresh air before turning in for the night. One of the men from the gas station had been seen lingering near the hotel parking lot around the same time Corey was last observed. This individual, still intoxicated and agitated, had not returned to wherever he was staying immediately after the confrontation at the gas station. The dimly lit parking area on the south side of the hotel provided both the privacy for an unwitnessed encounter and the proximity to the dangerous slope that would prove fatal. Investigators also consulted environmental experts to understand how the terrain, weather, and darkness would have affected events that night. The slope behind the hotel was steep, irregular, and covered in frost. In daylight, the drop-off was visible, but still hazardous. In the dark, especially to someone intoxicated or disoriented, the edge was nearly invisible. A struggle or sudden movement in that area could easily result in a fall. Despite the growing body of circumstantial evidence, investigators never obtained a direct confession from the individual believed to be responsible for Corey's death. The man had relocated years earlier, and efforts to locate and interview him proved challenging. When contact was finally established, he declined to cooperate with investigators, citing his right to remain silent and obtaining legal representation. Without a confession or direct forensic evidence linking him to the scene, prosecutors faced significant obstacles in pursuing criminal charges. The case rested on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and reconstructed timelines. Compelling to investigators, but insufficient for a guaranteed conviction in court. However, through indirect sources, friends, former associates, and individuals who had known the man in the years following Corey's disappearance, investigators pieced together a psychological profile consistent with someone carrying unresolved guilt. The man had struggled with substance abuse, legal troubles, and interpersonal instability in the years after leaving Peace River. He had made vague, cryptic statements to acquaintances about things that happened and mistakes you can't fix. While these statements did not constitute admissible evidence, they reinforced investigators' belief that the reconstructed timeline was accurate. The breakthrough in the Corey Shane Braun case was not a dramatic courtroom revelation or a DNA match that identified a killer. Instead, it was a slow, methodical process of assembling fragmented information into a coherent narrative that explained what had happened and why it had remained hidden for so long. The case pivoted from an unsolved mystery to an understood tragedy. Investigators came to believe with reasonable certainty that Corey had died as the result of a drunken confrontation that escalated into a physical struggle, followed by an accidental fall down the steep slope behind the Peace Valley Inns. The blow to his head had been severe enough to render him unconscious immediately. The freezing temperatures had done the rest. The man responsible had panicked. Driven by fear of legal consequences and impaired judgment, he had made the fatal decision to hide Corey's body rather than seek help. He had dragged Corey farther down the slope into concealed brush, intending to return later, but never following through. He had left Peace River months later, carrying the weight of his actions in silence. One of the key insights from the breakthrough phase was understanding how environmental factors had conspired to keep Corey's body hidden for so long. The slope behind the hotel was not a simple hillside. It was a complex landscape of irregular terrain, dense vegetation, and seasonal debris movement. When Corey's body came to rest in a concealed pocket of brush and fallen branches, it was already difficult to locate. The overnight snowfall covered the area, and subsequent winter weather further obscured the site. As spring arrived, runoff from the slope shifted soil and debris, gradually burying the site deeper. Vegetation growth in the warmer months added additional layers of concealment. By the time investigators understood where to look, the site had been transformed by years of natural processes. Recovery efforts would require specialized search teams, ground-penetrating radar, and careful excavation, resources that had not been deployed during the initial investigation. The breakthrough in understanding what happened to Corey Shane Braun did not translate into traditional legal justice. The individual believed to be responsible was never formally charged. The lack of direct forensic evidence, the absence of a confession, and the passage of time created insurmountable obstacles to prosecution. For Corey's family, the knowledge of what likely happened provided a measure of closure, but also profound frustration. They knew the truth, or at least a version of the truth supported by credible evidence. But they would never see accountability in a courtroom. Investigators acknowledged the limitations of the case. They had done everything within their power to reconstruct the events of November 20th, 2004. But the justice system requires more than probability and inference. It requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. And in Corey's case, that standard could not be met. The breakthrough in the Corey Shane Braun case had ripple effects beyond the immediate investigation. It highlighted the importance of revisiting cold cases with fresh eyes and new techniques. It demonstrated how witness cooperation can evolve over time, as fear and loyalty give way to conscience and the desire for resolution. And it underscored the critical role of terrain analysis and environmental expertise in missing persons investigations. For the Peace River and Fort St. John communities, the case served as a sobering reminder of how quickly alcohol-fueled confrontations can spiral into tragedy, and how silence, fear, and poor decisions can compound the damage exponentially. The resolution of Corey Shane Braun's case was not marked by handcuffs, a courtroom verdict, or the dramatic closure that families of missing persons desperately seek. Instead, it arrived quietly, incrementally, through the painstaking accumulation of witness accounts, environmental analysis, and investigative reconstruction that finally revealed what happened on the night of November 20th, 2004. The truth emerged not through traditional forensic breakthroughs, but through the slow work of assembling fragmented pieces into a coherent, devastating narrative. By the time investigators had reconstructed the likely sequence of events, the individual believed to be responsible for Corey's death had already distanced himself from Peace River, both physically and legally. The man had relocated years earlier, established a new life elsewhere, and demonstrated no willingness to cooperate with law enforcement inquiries. When investigators eventually located and attempted to interview him, he invoked his right to remain silent and retained legal counsel. Without a confession, direct eyewitness testimony, or forensic evidence conclusively linking him to the scene, prosecutors faced insurmountable obstacles in pursuing criminal charges. The evidence that investigators had assembled was compelling in its cumulative weight, but legally insufficient for prosecution. The reconstructed timeline showed that Corey had stepped back outside after initially heading toward his room, unsettled by the earlier gas station confrontation. It showed that one of the men from that altercation had lingered near the hotel parking lot, still intoxicated and agitated. It showed that the dimly lit area on the south side of the Peace Valley Inns provided both the opportunity for an unwitnessed encounter and dangerous proximity to the steep, frost-covered slope that descended toward the river valley. The timeline further indicated that a physical confrontation had occurred, resulting in Corey losing his footing and falling down the incline. The blow to his head from striking concealed debris or rock had rendered him unconscious immediately. The other man, panicking and aware of his own legal vulnerabilities, had made the fateful decision to drag Corey's body deeper into the brush rather than seek help. The sub-freezing temperatures that night had done the rest. Corey Shane Braun, 24 years old, had died only a short distance from where he was last seen, hidden in a pocket of terrain that would remain undiscovered for years. This narrative, supported by witness interviews, environmental forensics, and circumstantial behavioral evidence, provided investigators with moral certainty about what had occurred. But moral certainty does not meet the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Without physical evidence placing the suspect at the scene, without DNA linking him to Corey's body, and without a confession or eyewitness testimony, the case could not proceed to trial. 2. The legal classification of Corey's death remained frustratingly ambiguous. Technically, the case remained open as an unsolved missing persons investigation. Investigators believed they understood the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, combined with exposure to extreme cold. They believed they knew the mechanism: an accidental fall during a physical altercation, followed by deliberate concealment. They believed they knew who was responsible. But belief, no matter how well-founded, is not equivalent to prosecutable evidence. For the family, this represented a cruel paradox. After years of not knowing, they finally had answers. They understood what had happened to Corey and why he had never come home. But those answers came without justice. The person responsible would never face charges. There would be no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The resolution they had sought for so long arrived incomplete, offering knowledge but denying accountability. The official closure of the case came in stages. Investigators formally documented their findings in supplementary reports that detailed the reconstructed timeline, the witness interviews that supported it, and the environmental factors that had prevented earlier discovery. These reports acknowledged the limitations of the investigation while affirming the credibility of the conclusions reached. The case file was updated to reflect the current understanding of events, even though it could not be marked as solved in the traditional sense. Law enforcement agencies held meetings with Corey's family to explain the findings and the reasons why prosecution was not possible. These conversations were difficult and emotionally charged. Family members expressed gratitude for the renewed investigative efforts, while also voicing frustration and anger that the person responsible would never be held accountable. They understood the legal constraints, but could not accept them emotionally. The knowledge of what had happened provided a measure of closure, but it was closure tinged with bitterness and a profound sense of injustice. The confirmed evidence that investigators had assembled painted a clear picture. Corey had not left the hotel voluntarily. He had not been abducted by strangers. He had not wandered off in confusion or disorientation. He had been involved in a confrontation that escalated quickly, tragically, and fatally. The fall down the slope had been the immediate cause of his incapacitation. The cold had been the ultimate cause of death. And the decision to hide his body rather than call for help had transformed a terrible accident into something far darker. The environmental evidence was equally conclusive. The slope behind the Peace Valley Inns was steep, irregular, and treacherous even in daylight. At night, with frost covering the ground and no ambient light, it was a death trap. The concealed pocket where Corey's body came to rest was naturally camouflaged by vegetation and debris. The overnight snowfall had erased surface evidence. Subsequent seasonal changes, spring runoff, summer vegetation growth, autumn leaf fall, winter freeze, had progressively buried the site deeper. By the time investigators understood where to look, the location had been transformed by years of natural processes. Recovery efforts would have required specialized equipment, expert personnel, and significant resources. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained for long-buried remains, careful excavation techniques, and forensic analysis of degraded biological material would all be necessary. The steep terrain complicated access. The passage of time complicated preservation. Even if remains were recovered, the likelihood of obtaining usable forensic evidence that could link a specific individual to the scene was minimal. Investigators made the difficult decision not to pursue recovery operations. The family was consulted and given the option to press for excavation efforts, but the practical realities were sobering. The likelihood of successful recovery after so many years was uncertain. Even if recovery succeeded, the remains would likely be skeletal and degraded, offering little additional information beyond confirming what was already believed. The site would require extensive disturbance, with no guarantee of results. And most importantly, recovery would not change the legal reality. Without prosecutable evidence, the case could not move forward regardless of whether physical remains were located. The official classification settled into an uncomfortable middle ground. The case was not closed as solved because no charges were filed and no conviction obtained. It was not actively investigated because all viable leads had been exhausted. It existed in a liminal state, understood but unresolved, explained but not adjudicated. For administrative purposes, it remained an open missing persons case with detailed supplementary reports explaining what investigators believed had occurred. The resolution, such as it was, represented the limits of the justice system when confronted with cases where evidence has degraded. Witnesses are uncooperative, and circumstantial proof cannot rise to the level of legal certainty. It demonstrated how acts committed in darkness and concealed by silence can escape traditional accountability even when the broad outlines of truth become clear. For Corey's family, the resolution meant living with knowledge, but without justice. They knew their son had not abandoned them, had not chosen to disappear, had not met some mysterious fate beyond comprehension. They knew he had died quickly, without prolonged suffering, in the cold darkness behind a hotel where he had gone to celebrate with coworkers. They knew that someone else's fear and selfishness had transformed tragedy into a decades-long mystery. But they also knew that the person responsible would never face a courtroom, would never be forced to account for his actions, would never be held legally responsible for the choices that left Corey's body hidden in the brush, while his family searched desperately for answers. The official closure brought an end to active investigation, but not to grief. It provided explanation, but not peace. It represented the best possible outcome given the circumstances, and simultaneously, an outcome that felt profoundly inadequate to everyone involved. The resolution of Corey Shane Braun's case left his family navigating a landscape of grief that was both clarified and complicated by knowledge without justice. For over 20 years, they had lived with the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their son, brother, and loved one. When investigators finally reconstructed the likely sequence of events, the family gained answers they had desperately sought. But those answers came without the accountability they had equally craved. Corey's mother, father, and siblings had spent years cycling through hope and despair. Every phone call from law enforcement carried the possibility of news. Every anniversary of his disappearance brought renewed media attention and a resurgence of painful memories. Every holiday season served as a reminder that Corey had been attending a Christmas party when he vanished. The emotional toll was compounded by the frustrating lack of progress in the investigation and the silence from anyone who might have known what happened. When the breakthrough finally came, the family experienced a complex mix of relief and rage. Relief that they finally understood Corey had not abandoned them, had not chosen to disappear, and had not met some incomprehensible fate. Rage that someone had made the conscious decision to hide his body rather than call for help, condemning the family to decades of uncertainty. The knowledge that Corey had died quickly, without prolonged suffering, offered small comfort against the larger injustice of what followed. The family's relationship with law enforcement evolved throughout the investigation. In the early years, there was frustration with what they perceived as insufficient effort and inadequate resources dedicated to finding Corey. As the case went cold, that frustration deepened into resignation. When renewed investigative efforts began, hope rekindled, only to be tempered by the reality that understanding what happened did not guarantee legal resolution. The family expressed gratitude for the investigators' persistence, while simultaneously struggling with the limitations of the justice system. For the Fort St. John and Peace River communities, Corey's case became emblematic of the dangers that young oil field workers faced. Not from the inherent hazards of their jobs, but from the social environments surrounding that work. The oil industry in northern British Columbia and Alberta employed thousands of young men who worked long, demanding shifts and often celebrated together during downtime. Alcohol-fueled gatherings were common. Confrontations, while usually harmless, occasionally spiraled into tragedy. Corey's disappearance served as a sobering reminder that momentary decisions made under the influence of alcohol and pride could have permanent, devastating consequences. Community members who had known Corey remembered him as hardworking, personable, and well-liked among his colleagues. His disappearance had rattled the tight-knit oil field community, where workers looked out for one another and news traveled quickly. Many of his former co-workers carried guilt for years, questioning whether they could have done something differently the night he vanished. Should they have insisted he come inside immediately? Should they have noticed the man from the gas station lingering in the parking lot? These questions haunted them even after the reconstructed timeline made clear that Corey's fate was sealed by circumstances beyond their control or awareness. The case also sparked conversations about the culture of silence that can surround tragic events. Someone had seen something. Someone had known something. Yet fear of legal consequences, loyalty to friends, or simple self-preservation had kept critical information hidden for years. The eventual breakthrough came only when witnesses felt safe or compelled enough to share what they knew. This pattern highlighted the importance of witness protection, the value of cold case reviews, and the need for communities to understand that silence protects perpetrators while prolonging suffering for families. Memorial efforts for Corey took various forms over the years. His family maintained a presence on social media and missing persons networks, ensuring his case remained visible even as years passed without resolution. True crime podcasts and online forums periodically revisited his disappearance, keeping public attention alive. After the investigative breakthrough, these platforms shifted focus from seeking information to honoring Corey's memory and advocating for similar cold cases to receive renewed attention. The family also became involved in broader advocacy efforts related to missing persons investigations. They pushed for better initial search protocols, particularly in cases involving difficult terrain and harsh weather conditions. They advocated for specialized training and equipment that could improve recovery efforts in challenging environments. They supported legislative initiatives aimed at improving resources for cold case investigations and ensuring that families of missing persons received consistent communication from law enforcement agencies. For the individual believed to be responsible for Corey's death, the aftermath was one of permanent psychological burden. Though he was never formally charged or publicly identified by authorities, the weight of what happened followed him throughout his life. According to indirect accounts gathered by investigators, he struggled with substance abuse, legal troubles unrelated to Corey's case, and difficulty maintaining stable relationships. The cryptic statements he made to acquaintances about past mistakes and irreparable damage suggested a conscience that never found peace. His decision to remain silent meant he carried the full weight of guilt without the possibility of redemption through accountability. The broader impact of Corey's case extended into how northern communities approach safety, responsibility, and care for one another. It prompted conversations in workplaces, families, and social circles about the real consequences of confrontations that seem minor in the moment. It reinforced the message that calling for help, even when afraid, even when potentially facing consequences, is always preferable to silence and concealment. More than 20 years after Corey Shane Braun disappeared from the Peace Valley Inns, his case remains a powerful reminder of how tragedy can unfold in an instant and how the choices made in its immediate aftermath can compound suffering exponentially. His family continues to honor his memory while living with the incomplete resolution they received. The communities that knew him carry forward the lessons learned from his loss. And somewhere, the person responsible for hiding Corey's body that frozen November night lives with the permanent consequences of fear-driven silence.